Hello Year 12, it's Mrs. Gill here and I'm going to be taking your lesson today. This is our fourth lesson on women's rights in America. And as you can see, we're going to be looking at how much progress was there in women's rights during the Gilded Age. So first I'd like you to get yourself ready for the lesson, and you are going to need your history resources, which were on Show My Homework, a pen, some lined paper, and I'd ask you to put away or turn off any distractions. Press pause and get yourself ready, and press play when you are. Last lesson, we looked at the role of women in political reform. So your do now task is all about that. You have 5 questions to answer, and I'd like you to pause the video and try to answer them from memory without your notes. This will tell you how much you remember from last lesson and what you might need to look over again. Pause now, and when you are finished, press play. Well done, and here are the answers. I'd like you to pause the video and mark your own. If you get any wrong, I'd like you to write the answer in a different colour pen. Don't forget to give yourself a score out of 5 for how many you got correct. So today's lesson title is How Much Progress Was There in Women's Rights During the Gilded Age? And the aims of today's lesson is that we understand the social, economic and political rights women had by the end of the Gilded Age in 1895. We are going to try to explain, using evidence, how the position and rights of women improved during the Gilded Age. And then at the end of the lesson, we are going to do an evaluation of a historian's interpretation of women in the Gilded Age. Now, because our lesson today is on the Gilded Age, it's a separate depth study in Unit 3. And so you've got a brand new knowledge organiser. Now, it's not as detailed as your previous one, and there is some information that overlaps. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video, read through this knowledge organiser, because we are going to be covering it all just in today's lesson, and then update it by highlighting the keywords and the events. Press pause to do this, and then when you're ready, press play. Now it's time for your starter. I'd like you to look at the photograph that is on the screen. It's a sweatshop in Ludlow Street, Tenement, New York City, around 1889. And there's 2 questions I'd like you to think about. What are the conditions like? What do you notice about the workers at this sweatshop? I want you to press pause and write down your ideas, and then when you're ready, press play. So let's have a look at what you could have written for this starter task. The conditions are very cramped. You may notice there are at least 6 people in this small room working very, very closely together. The furniture is also quite cramped. Even the pictures on the wall are very close to each other. You may have noticed that this sweatshop is set up in a room. It's not a factory. And you may also have spotted the dog under one of the chairs. So this suggests that perhaps this might be somebody's living room or part of their home, and workers have come there just for the day to get some work done. The workers They're a mixture of male and female workers, and you can see they are working very hard on creating textiles or clothes. And based on the conditions they're working in and what they're wearing themselves, they probably aren't paid very well. I want you to press pause and write down anything you missed, and then press play when you're ready. Now we have looked at the Gilded Age period before when we were studying African American civil rights. Just going to quickly recap what the Gilded Age was. It's a period of industrialization and economic growth, which historians date to around 1875 and 1895. It's a period in which America really boomed economically, and businessmen and industrialists became much richer, whilst workers, on the other hand, often were paid very low amounts of money. And so that's what this cartoon shows, the industrialists at the top living in luxury, whilst the workers who are supporting them are struggling. It's also a period where there was lots of immigration. Thousands, if not millions, of Europeans migrated to America at this time. And this meant there was lots of workers, and again it allowed industrialists and businessmen to exploit them by not paying them very much. It's also a period in which transport across America improved significantly, and quite a lot of money and resources went into building a vast network of trains and railways across America, again to help speed production and trade and the economy. It's also a period in which how people made money changed. More work was done outside of the family home, in factories, even sweatshops, rather than in traditional rural environments. So people didn't necessarily work on it as much on their land, and many people migrated or moved to big cities where there were these industrial opportunities. Now we've reminded ourselves of what the Gilded Age was roughly, we are now going to add to our knowledge by focusing on women and the impact the Gilded Age had on them. Now there's several key points that have been summarised onto your knowledge organiser, so you don't have to write these down, but it may help you if you'd like to. Women continued to take an active role in public activities during the Gilded Age, and in particular it's the temperance movement that really developed even further during the Gilded Age, with the increase of immigration and the increase of industrialization led to a lot more drinking and use of alcohol, and so women felt like they needed to do something to try and stop alcohol and the problems it caused in the family home and in society. However, despite the fact that again lots of women were getting involved in other public activities such as trying to get the vote, little progress was achieved in getting the right to vote nationally. And this cartoon kind of shows this. Despite women going out, protesting, lobbying, there was still a lot of reluctance to give women the vote. There was also a huge diversification of the economy, and obviously the expansion of the economy did offer more opportunities in terms of jobs for women. And in particular, you do see the increase of women in what is called white collar work. Now, by that means work that is more to do with clerical work, so making records, or professional work. At this time, the expanding economy meant that for quite a few professions and trades, they needed an educated workforce. So this actually led to some progress in education for women. Again, however, we must be careful because this wouldn't have necessarily been available to all women. It would have probably been only for middle to upper class women. Now, what I would like you to do is look at some evidence about the Gilded Age and the impact it had on women. So, two of the sheets that are provided for you on Show My Homework, you're going to read through the information in the evidence table. And first, you're just going to be focusing on the evidence itself. And I'd like you to colour or highlight each box to categorise the information into whether it's talking about the social position or rights of women, the economic position or rights of women, or the political position and rights of women. I've even included at the top something you could use as a key to help you. So I'd like you to press pause and complete this task. And when you are ready, press play. So you have just categorised the information and evidence into whether it's showing social, economic or political position and rights for women. What I'd like you to do now is to read through the evidence again, but this time I want you to identify in the columns provided whether each piece of information or evidence implies a lack in progress in position and rights of women or gains in position and rights of women. Press pause to complete this task, and when you're ready, press play. Well done, Year 12, for completing both those tasks using the evidence. On the screen, I have given you what your work might look like, so you can compare it to see if it's similar to mine. You may want to press pause to compare your work to mine before we move on. Let's now return to the arguments I showed you earlier in the lesson about the position of women during the Gilded Age. I'm going to ask you to use the evidence to try to explain these arguments about the position and rights of women during the Gilded Age. In other words, to show your understanding of where these arguments may have come from and what evidence there is to strengthen and support them. This would be really helpful for your own understanding and for your notes. Press pause and complete this task. And when you're ready, press play. So now that we have looked at evidence of the social, economic, and political changes that occurred to women during the Gilded Age, and we have tried to explain some arguments using evidence. We're now going to have a look at a historical interpretation of the impact the Gilded Age had on women. Now, I've provided you with a small passage which has been adapted from Sarah M. Evans and her work Born for Liberty, A History of Women in America. I'd like you to pause the video and read through the interpretation. And in particular, there's two things I'd like you to do. After you've read it, I want you to write down what view does it have of the Gilded Age and its impact for women. And then I'd like you to identify a particular quote from the passage that you could use to support this. Now, this will help you make sure that when you are summarising a historian's interpretation, that you don't just paraphrase or copy it. You need to summarise it into your own words if possible, and then support it with a quote. Press pause to complete this task, and then I'll show you an example of what you could have written afterwards. So here's our passage. Now, first of all, I asked you to write down what view does this passage have of the Gilded Age and its impact for women. So you could have written something like this. According to the passage, during the Gilded Age, women were more prominent in public life. You'll notice I've tried not to just copy exactly what the passage says, and tried to put it into my own words, summarising the view. Then you need to identify a quote you could use to support this. It doesn't have to be a long quote. Sometimes the best isn't. So I have identified this. The passage states, public life seemed to be filling with more women. So I'd like you to compare what you've written to what's on the screen. It doesn't matter if it's not exactly the same, but as long as it's similar, then it shows that you were able to do this with very little trouble. Pause to do that and then press play when you're ready. Now that you have summarised the particular view in the interpretation and backed it up with a quote, we are now going to evaluate the interpretation. And what I mean by that is you are going to need to decide how convincing you find it as an explanation of the impact of the Gilded Age on women. Now, there's a couple of things you may want to consider when you are evaluating the interpretation. First of all, you might want to think about what information or evidence you have in your own contextual knowledge that could be used to support the interpretation. So in other words, what information you have that also implies that women were more prominent in public life during this time. You also may want to consider what information or evidence you have in your contextual knowledge that could challenge the interpretation. In other words, that might show that women were still not fully prominent in public life and there were still maybe some restrictions on their involvement, or that they were only involved in public life in regards to maybe social rather than political areas. And thirdly, you might want to think about what key information about women in the Gilded Age is missing. So in other words, what has our historian perhaps chosen not to focus on? Is there any social, economic and political information in regards to women that they have decided not to include and therefore that might make it less convincing as an explanation of the impact of the Gilded Age on women. I'd like you to press pause and complete this task. Take your time, it's very good practice, and when you're ready, press play. That is the end of our lesson today, Year 12. Well done. We only have one more lesson looking at women this half term, which will be on the YouTube channel in the next few days. So if you subscribe, you won't miss it. I look forward to teaching you again for the final time in a few days' time.